Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's very nice to be here. Some of you may notice this is a slight change to your published programme. You often know when I either pop up on the telly or walk onto the stage that something has gone wrong. In this case, the minister isn't here yet. Now, I'm used to filling for TV, so I can do that. In fact, I sort of learned to fill at the BBC, where before I went to Channel 4 20 years ago, I did the launch of the news channel. And everything used to go wrong all the time, and people wouldn't turn up, and you'd be interviewing the wrong person. My worst moment was when all the technology failed. It was the beginning of a digital technology sort of overhaul at the BBC, and all the technology failed, and nobody knew what was going on. And then they put somebody next to me who I didn't have written down. I didn't know who they were, and nobody told me who they were. And they just said, "Go to the guest, go to the guest." And I didn't know who he was, so I just had to turn to him and say, "Hello, I'm Krishnan. I don't know who you are or what you're here to talk about, but perhaps you could begin by telling me." And we sort of went from there. So I will fill for as long as Al Milton gets here. It's slightly annoying because I wanted to respond to her rather than preempt her. Because normally, again, the other thing you might know when I come on the stage is, you're going to hear some bad news and some hard truths. Because we can, and you will, I'm sure, over the course of this conference, talk about the skills gap and T-levels and all the opportunities of introducing that, of rising standards, of what Ofsted is saying about 70% of colleges being good or outstanding. And then all, of course, the challenges of Brexit and what that will mean. But, if you don't, within about 2 minutes of any speech, say a simple thing at a college's conference, then you're going to make a big mistake, and that is you have got a massive funding crisis, and you need to do something about it. The truth is, colleges are the Cinderella of the education system, and you're not getting the attention, and you're not sort of getting the argument made out there for you. Now, why do I care? Well, like a lot of people in my position, I went to school, good school. I did my A-levels at school, and I went straight on to university. But when I was growing up in Lancashire, in East Lancashire, and to be honest, still in my life now, the college was very important to a lot of people's lives, even if you didn't have your base education there. I did a photography O-level at my local college, alongside what I was doing at school, because my school didn't offer it. My mum did a catering course because she wanted to start a business. My sister did her A-levels there after going to school because she wanted to get better grades. And even now, my wife, where we live in Richmond, decided to retrain from being a journalist to being a photographer. She got the skills she needed to do that by going to our local college. And now my children go to our local college during the holidays because they put on amazing courses for kids that a lot of people don't know about. And when you tell your friends that they're learning filmmaking on iPhones at the local college, they're quite surprised that those sorts of opportunities are put on. So I think the biggest problem that you face as a sector is people not realizing, despite the fact that you touch millions of lives, people not really making the connection and not really seeing how you have become the poor relation of education. We do need to just hammer home what the facts are in the course of this. Further education cut more sharply than funding for schools, preschool, or higher education. The reality is that you're all looking at course closures, less time in the classroom for 16 to 18-year-olds by comparison to many international standards, job losses, pay freezes, pay falls, and cuts to student support. You've gone from having more per pupil funding than secondary schools when most of you came into the profession to less. The Institute for Fiscal Studies report, much quoted, but it's worth reminding ourselves again, just so that we know what the baseline is for this conference and for this argument. Since 2010, funding per student aged 16 to 18 in further education has fallen by 8% in real terms. Funding for adult education has been cut by 45% since 2009-10, mostly delivered through fewer adult learners taking qualifications at GCSE or below. And by 2019-20, funding per young person in further education about the same level as 2006 and 2007. That's only 10% higher than it was 30 years ago in 1989. And before anyone says, but it's been worse in secondary schools, again, remind anybody who's talking to you that secondary schools had a higher base. As my former boss at Channel 4, Tim Gardam, in fact, he's the man who gave me my job at Channel 4 News 20 years ago, and is now the chief executive of the Nuffield Foundation, said, the Institute for Fiscal Studies Analysis questions the capacity of the system to successfully deliver the reforms currently underway without additional funding. Neglect in investment has knock-on effects from one educational stage to others, from the point of view of the individual student and the education system as a whole. So this argument is really simple. As you just heard, it should be very, very straightforward to say, you've even got the boss of Ofsted on your side, who said real terms cuts to further education funding are affecting the sustainability and quality of further education provision. Now, the call that you've heard from Amanda Spillman so far may be a sort of a statement of the obvious. The baseline has been frozen for 5 years. Of course it needs to go up. But it's a question of where. And yet, Theresa May has a slightly different take on college funding. She is still Prime Minister. When asked recently about raising the base rate, what was her response? Well, a lot of it was a slight statement of the obvious. We've invested nearly £7 billion this year to make sure there's an educational training place for every 16 to 19-year-old who wants one. The £7 billion is obviously for people who aren't involved in the sector to say that's a lot of money. We're also transforming technical education through the T-levels, and with £500 million a year once they're fully rolled out. Many of you will know that number wasn't actually right. It's more like £50 million a year less than that. And by 2020, the funding available to support adult participation in further education is planned to be higher than at any time in England's history. So, despite the apparent obviousness of your case for funding, the government is not going to roll over easily, and is clearly going to keep making the case that they're already doing an awful lot. Ministers talk about protecting the base rate, that they are proud of having protected the base rate for your students since 2015. Protecting is a very interesting way of framing it. It's a very clever way of framing it. Suppose we said we are going to protect MP salaries for the next 5 years by keeping them where they are. Is that protecting or freezing or in reality cutting? Most of you know the answers to that. Now, they asked me here to say, well, talk about the next year, because everybody is feeling a bit insecure and nobody really knows what's going to happen over the next year. So how are you going to navigate the next year? What is likely to happen? Because the job of colleges is to help people realize their ambitions, to help them onto the next stage of life and to acquire the skills and the confidence they need to tackle their futures. Well, what we know is that there is an extraordinary skills shortage. Employers are having to look hard for the people they need. Pay is going up, despite opportunities in the last few months contracting slightly, which shows that the skills gap is even worse than we thought. And of course, there's Brexit. Now, in theory, Brexit should be a great opportunity for you and your sector. It should be a real chance for you to make a big case when it comes to the spending review in 2019. If it's going to be harder to bring in foreign labour, and whatever happens, it will be more bureaucratic, there will be delays, it will be time-consuming, and there will also be, as we've already seen in the period since the referendum result, a sense among some European migrants of not feeling wanted anymore, and so perhaps choosing other places to think about their futures. So that should mean more opportunities for people coming out of colleges, for your students. It's a good job we all know what's going to happen then, isn't it? Now, I have never known a more bizarre period in British politics. You know, you were joking a few minutes ago about what was happening this time last year. It is a bizarre time in which it feels like an awful lot changes minute to minute. Who knows what's going to happen? But then actually, not a lot in truth changes. You know, if you think about the government's strategy on Brexit and Theresa May's strategy has been, well, it kind of almost harps back to her election press conference where she was being given a hard time about changing her policy on something, and she said, nothing has changed, nothing has changed. That is the government's policy on Brexit. They have got a strategy, they have got a draft agreement now, and they are not caving in. So you will see lots of people walking up the streets of Downing Street, as we did yesterday, and then they walk out silent. You will see the Brexiteers and the European Reform Group talking about all the changes they want, and the government holding the line. Because the government's strategy since the very beginning of this whole process has been to make everybody else blink. They believe they've got it right. They believe they've got the best deal. They are now in the position whereby the European Union is telling everybody that's the best deal you're going to get, so don't think about renegotiating it. And that applies both to the Brexiteers and the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, which is saying, well, we would renegotiate. So their whole MO from now on is just to sit tight and go, no, we are right, and you've got to blink. So where does that leave them? Well, the DUP, the Democratic Unionists, who are pro-Brexit, are against them. And we now know that from yesterday because they voted against the government in a key vote on the budget. And it doesn't seem likely that they will shift because there is no way within this draft agreement or any draft agreement that Northern Ireland cannot be treated differently to the rest of the United Kingdom because it needs that in order to be able to keep a soft border. And that's the one thing that now everybody is just beginning to get their heads around, that if you want to leave the European Union, you have to have a border unless you have special arrangements. And so Northern Ireland has special arrangements. It's very difficult to see how the government can change their position on that. The European Reform Group is broadly against them. They're the sort of Jacob Rees-Mogg group of conservatives in the Conservative Party, but they have got two problems. It's a matter of holding their nerve on the one hand, and also of staying united. Now, they have already split over whether or not to move against Theresa May. Some in that group think that they've got to move against her now. That's why Jacob Rees-Mogg came out so quickly and said he'd written this letter, and they need 48 letters, and they haven't got them yet. However, a lot of other Brexiteers in that group think now is not the time to move, and that what we should do is wait to see what happens in Parliament, and then if the deal as they expect is voted down in the first or second week of December, that's the time at which to decide they want a new Conservative leader. So the question is, you know, what do they do, and what do they do about the deal itself? Because there are also a large number of Brexiteers who are thinking and are worrying that Theresa May's opening up now of the possibility of no Brexit does change the game. You've got the Gang of Five, the sort of curiously named Gang of Five, of Gove, Fox, Grayling, Leadsom and Mordaunt. I don't know who called them the Gang of Five, but I don't think they've ever been in a gang. But they have taken the calculation that any Brexit at the moment is better than no Brexit, and that you can fix it in the future. Therefore, you should go for the deal. And it is possible that this fear of Brexit not happening at all, if they vote down this deal, is going to bring more of the Brexiteers round. The arithmetic, though, is still very, very difficult, because if the DUP are out, a big chunk of the ERG are out, Labour is also officially against the deal. Jeremy Corbyn now, again, yesterday, made that very, very clear, that Labour's current position is to vote against the deal. The question is, how many rebels are there? And there are Labour MPs who say, we cannot, in all conscience, do anything that takes us further towards a no-deal Brexit. And they are worried that if Brexit doesn't happen at all, they will be accused of betrayal by their constituents, because many of them are Labour MPs who voted to remain themselves, but are in constituencies where people voted to leave. Now, the interesting thing about that is that that may be shifting slightly. I did a programme 2 weeks ago in which we conducted the biggest poll survey that's happened since the referendum. It was 20,000 people, which is an incredibly large sample, about 10 or 15 times an average opinion poll, adjusted by clever mathematicians to make it even more bomb-proof and representative. And that came out with a headline figure of 54-46 to Remain now. And the biggest swings were in constituencies in the north and the northeast of England and Wales, where people very strongly voted to leave. So you have this strange position now of MPs trying to calculate what's the right thing to do. They wanted to remain, their constituents voted to leave, but their constituents might now be changing their minds. So it's a very, very difficult time to work out what's going on. It is still possible that enough people will cave in and the deal goes through. But the other scenario is that if the deal is voted down, Theresa May then has to go back to Brussels and try and renegotiate some sort of tweak. People keep talking about the tweak. We have no idea what the tweak means or what the tweak would be. So we have no reason to, really be confident that we know how things will change and why any of the people who are currently opposed to the deal would then suddenly change their minds on this massive point of principle and back the government. So we then have the scenario of a defeat. What happens in the event of a defeat? Well, Theresa May has a couple of choices. She can decide to hand the keys to number 10 to Jeremy Corbyn, which is not looking very likely.
Thank you, Steph.
The party can move against her and try and replace her, which is also going to be very, very difficult unless it's just done by acclamation and there isn't any contest. Or she can call a general election, which again is not looking very, very likely because we know what happened last time. Or she can think about having a second referendum, a people's vote. And that's what's got people sort of a bit jumpy, I think, in the ERG, that this scenario is now starting to look more possible than it did before. What all of this means is that while politics is playing this out, there is a massive opportunity cost to what's going on in the country. And that's how this all affects you. Because people aren't really thinking or paying attention to what's going on in your sectors. And while you've got this spending review coming up next year, Theresa May has already made a massive commitment to the NHS, and it's not clear whether there's very much money left for anything else. And believe me, you're not the only sector who's feeling hard done by and is not thinking about how they make a case going into the spending review next year. There is not an awful lot of room for manoeuvre. And so there is going to be a sense of only those people who shout loudest will shout the most. The minister's here by the sound of it, so I can wind up. So what I would say, I had to come on early, she can wait a little bit. What I would say is you need to make your case. You need to make your case with a lot of people who didn't necessarily go to colleges, who don't send their children to colleges. And I'm talking about politicians, civil servants, and the media. You are facing a bunch of people who don't, on the whole, use your services. And so you've got to make your case and tell them what you do. I've explained to you at the beginning, very briefly, how your sector has changed my family, I'm sure I'm not that unusual. So you need to go out there and tell people about it. It is difficult because schools are also out there. And so when you had your march and the head teachers from schools had their march, it was the head teachers' march that got a little bit more attention. So you've got to think about timing as well and what you're going to do. But I would think about the people in power, think about how you influence them, think about how you show off your services, and then shout as loud as you can, because whatever happens with Brexit, and it might go on forever, nothing very much might change for years, they are going to have to take some spending decisions and start concentrating on the rest of the country before too long. So I will watch with great interest and enjoy doing the interviews both with you lot and their lot before too long. Thank you very much.